Hello and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Christopher and I'm delighted that you can join us for our very special guest tonight, Nate Powell. Nate has won several Eisner and Ignatz Awards and also the National Book Award. He has over 20 titles that he has either illustrated or illustrated and wrote. His most recent book is Fall Through. He has also illustrated John Lewis's March trilogy, and most recently his book is here. It's the adaptation and illustration of Lies My Teacher Told Me. We are we are so happy to have his artwork in the lower level, so you can check that out after the talk. And Nate has his books and original artwork for sale that you can visit right after the talk too. Please help me welcome Nate Powell.
Hey everybody. Okay, so I just went to go do like that last nervous pee before starting to talk, and the second I got in there, and he started talking, I was like, if I time this correctly, this will be like a WWE intro, and like flames are gonna go up, and it'll be like, I will destroy you, or whatever. So you can just imagine that's how it went down. And now everybody's like, yeah, get the folding chair, or whatever. Okay. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here. Good to see you on this lovely, picturesque Southern Michigan Friday evening. It's always a delight to be in Ann Arbor, a place I visited for the last 25 years on and off. All right, so this year's been weird. 2 new books, 1 fiction, 1 nonfiction. Both came out just 2 months apart. Not my choice, rolling with it. So I'm going to try to talk about these 2 books simultaneously in the space I normally talk about 1 book. So far, it's worked out pretty well. But along the way, we're gonna talk about some really interesting stuff. Okay. All right. So this talk can also be called How I Spent the Pandemic. Both of these books, Fall Through and Lies My Teacher Told Me, are pretty much the only things I did for 3 years besides dad stuff. Alrighty, so first I guess we're just gonna jump in with Lies My Teacher Told Me. Alrighty, nonfiction first, because we're in a library. Like there aren't fiction, like there's not fiction in a library. Okay, so I first read the original edition of Lies My Teacher Told Me around 2004. And it was a few years before that where I was really kind of like, through A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, all of a sudden a lot of stuff that I had absorbed, especially through like record inserts in, underground punk records, writings in fanzines, all of a sudden the stuff that slightly older people had acquired now had accurately sourced material that I could refer to. And I was like, aha. And Lies My Teacher Told Me was very much a part of that process of getting to like adultify a lot of the stuff that I knew through my angry adolescence about an unfair, messed up world. Okay, so Lies My Teacher Told Me originally came out in 1995. There was an updated edition in 2017. And in between those two, James Loewen, pictured above, released a young reader's edition. And it sold, combined, it has sold several million copies. Importantly, in the world of 2024, I argue that as we are all facing, challenges on multiple fronts from this very organized, very pushy, book banning, information control loving, reality averse sliver of society, I would argue that Lies My Teacher Told Me, specifically in the mid-90s, helped people crystallize and articulate a lot of the core concepts and even a lot of the terms that we use to discuss uncomfortable truths, accurate history, but even getting into the nuts and bolts of how information finds its way into the classroom or is left out of the classroom. Also, side note, sweet Abe Lincoln beard. I also had an Abe Lincoln beard for a good 5 years in the second half of the 90s. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet James Lowen in person. He passed away in August 2021, a couple months before we were going to finally meet up at the Indianapolis airport and hang out for a little while. But I was actually planning to show him pictures of my own Abe Lincoln at that time. So I always admire his keeping the spirit of Abe alive as well. So originally, right before the world shut down, James Lowen wrote me out of the blue. He emailed me late January 2020 and was like, Nate, I'm not sure how familiar you are with my work. I believe we may have met at the National Book Festival many years ago when you were speaking with Congressman Lewis, et cetera. I was wondering if you have any interest in doing a comics adaptation of this book I did, Lies My Teacher Told Me. And I immediately wrote back without talking to my agent or anyone else. And I was like, hello. And I was like, yes, definitely count me in. We'll work out the details along the way. Not only do I feel like I've waited my entire life to do something like this, but I already see in my head how I want it to look, and it's going to be awesome. So I was like, let's just do it. And very soon after that, we started talking on the phone. He was, I believe, 78 at the time, but just this really like high energy, very positive guy with so much clarity and perspective on his own life. And he was very upfront from our very first phone call when we decided we were going to do this together. He's like, this is great. I'm really looking forward to it. One thing you should know, I have stage 4 cancer and I'm going to die. He's like, I'm not in remission, but things are actually great right now. I'm totally healthy. Everything's fine. But he's like, I don't know if it's going to get me in 6 years or in 6 months. I don't know. So let's make this thing. And when my time comes, my time comes. And that was just sort of this like staggering thing for him to just kind of toss out there. And I just really admired how forthcoming he was and really just how at peace he was with his situation and just brought so much more of my growing sense of his self to the project as we began speaking on the phone. So he mailed me, a fresh copy of it, inscribed, I hope you will carry it on. Now the first thing, then the world shut down. So basically, I had already read Lies My Teacher Told Me probably 3 or 4 times. So I started reading it again, specifically with an eye to break it down into comics form. So as I was reading, obviously lots of underlining, lots of notes, but the first sort of formal and structural challenge was I was like, this is like a 500-page book. The one thing I don't want this book to be is like a 500-page brick of comics. So I said, I'm a believer in limitations, defining your approach, your style, and sort of giving you more freedom by recognizing the shape of the box that you're in. So I was like, this book absolutely can't be over 300 pages. So I'm going to aim for 250. And what does that mean as I'm reading through all of this? And so I was like, okay, there's tons of information in here. How do I begin to filter through so many of these historical anecdotes and just this rich treasure trove of information to make it something that is actually digestible and under 300 pages? What helped was then reading the Young Readers edition. Almost all the same stuff is included, and there are a few differences in like wording and sentence structure, but really, I noticed by reading the Young People's edition that as a storyteller, as a historian and storyteller, James Lowen does in fact have a narrative thread. And so I was able to kind of see what his central points were within each chapter using key examples, but then also it was much easier to see where the larger arc would carry over some of his smaller points from chapter to chapter. It was just kind of like cutting away a little bit of the extra anecdotal information. So then once I read through that and I could sort of see his narrative journey, I could go back to the full edition And it was much easier to kind of peel away, like actually find the skeleton of his writing that made up the book. And as I was moving along, then trying to figure out what to do with the information that was in the footnotes, etc. Okay, so I'm someone who very much believes like we shouldn't memory hole things, and memory holing the recent past is a big part of this book. So let's take a trip back to 2020. This is my now 9-year-old Everly, and this was the beginning of elementary school for her. This is online kindergarten. Many of us experienced something like this. So I spent that first, the fall and early winter of 2020 sitting on this dirty futon that our very happy, somewhat dim-witted dog sleeps on. And while Everly was doing online kindergarten, I would be reading through these volumes and underlining and breaking them down into pages, and that is how I spent while helping with online kindergarten, etc. This is the only photo that exists of the original book with its notations, and then my sketchbook as I'm beginning to actually turn it into individual comic pages. Okay, now on one of these pages, let's also note there in the upper right, shout out to anybody who kept track of the days starting from like March 12th or March 13th. So this is day 191, September 19th, 2020. Basically, I was taking all of my notes, and along the way, I was figuring this seems like this is about a page's worth of stuff. This is a good place to do a page break. So here I start actually breaking it down into thumbnail versions of the entire book, called thumbnails, because they are so small, they're really just meant to make sure you have enough space for all of the text, that panels are able to flow in a logical way and guide the reader through each page. It's not intended to hold a lot of information, and you're supposed to be able to work quickly. What's wild about this is I could have done this in, I'm sure, a much smarter way. So I had the books, I was reading them, taking notes. You may notice the entire right-hand side of this. I rewrote the entire book by hand in my sketchbook. And yes, I use a little bit of shorthand and stuff, but each little circled number is a panel on that page. And I just wrote the entire book in pencil. And I was like, all right, I got this, and slowly starting to develop my script. So that's time number 1. I hand wrote the entire book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. All right, we were going to keep count. And then I had to basically make some demo pages to show to James Lowen and show to the editors and the publisher. And so I did a couple of pages just to be like, this is what the book will look like. I typed up my version of the text, which is just in regular. And then in bold here, I have either little changes I might have made, and some of that has to do with updating the text beyond 2017. Some of it has to do with questions, notes, and pushback that I may have to sort of reevaluate this. I mean, part of the theme of the book is that history is a living thing, and it requires being engaged with it and being willing to ask questions about our understanding of history as our understanding of history grows and changes. So this is a little intimidating because now I'm like writing the author of this influential book, sort of like wondering about intersectionality and pushing back to make a special note about like the failed Iranian Revolution that resulted in an authoritarian theocracy in the section where he's trying to talk about popular democratic movements, and I specifically want to note that it failed. And I'm like, oh, here we go, hit send. Thankfully, he just wrote right back, and in red, these are James Lowen's notes, where basically he is just very graciously and thoroughly answering so many questions that I have along the way. And a lot of this is like stuff that was unresolved in 2020, bringing up like intersections with Me Too and its relationship with the movement for Black Lives throughout the 2010s. And I wanted to bring up, in note number 2, Susan B. Anthony and many early suffrage leaders being in alignment or alliances with white supremacist groups, because the 19th century suffrage movement was full of people who often perceived concurrent black rights movements as challenging a spotlight designated for their own movement. And it was wild to be like, well, I didn't read that in the book, but I know this is true, so what do you think about this? And it was wild to be treated on equal footing, to be like, yeah, it's a good point. Let's take that into consideration. So at that point, then I penciled the entire book. All right, so this is basically, my pencils are usually kind of rough. I do most of my thinking with the ink. But as I penciled the whole book, I also first lettered everything in pencil, knowing that I would have to tweak and change some things. So then I wrote the entire book a second time. Then once that was done, I of course lettered it in ink after I got the edits, which is a third time. But in between those two, along the way, I was like, dear publisher, do you think you guys can just like send me a Word document of the book? It would be really helpful. And it just like didn't, whatever. Somebody like missed the memo. And at a certain point, I was like, when I finished the pencils to the book, I was like, they're not a comic book publisher. I'm not like, it would probably be helpful if they just had a text document of what I am putting in the book. And I was like, damn it. I'm going to have to write them a Word document that's their own book. And so I just sat down with my penciled pages, and I wrote the entire book back for a fourth time, I guess, in Word document form and sent it back to them. And I was like, this is why I asked for a Word document. But it worked out all right. Okay. I work almost entirely just physically on paper. A lot of that is a product of my age. And like, I graduated from high school the last year before there was a computer in my high school period. And I went to art school the very last year before any cartooning students were required to take any computer classes. So I feel like I've got my thing going. I'm doing fine. I don't have time to learn this stuff. So I find what works for me, and it works great. Generally, yeah, I just have a couple of erasers, a mechanical pencil. I do all my lettering with cheap Micron technical pens, and I do all my inking either with a number 2 watercolor brush or with a little Croquill nib pen that I change every once in a while. They cost $1 a piece. And I just use India ink and a little bit of white ink for this book, and that's it. A lot of this has to do with like, pages are so time intensive and require so many steps that if you're able to think vaguely and then move into specific time intensive practices along the way, you can make big changes or discover big mistakes along the way, and it's not really a loss of time if you have to like start over. So this is what my pencils look like. And I like to keep them gestural so that things don't wind up looking too kind of stiff and dry when they're finished. But usually I'll pencil something in maybe like 20 or 30 minutes. And then I'll ink it and finish it in maybe in another 3 hours or so. And so there it is with the inks, with the washes and the lettering over it. It always kind of looks like magic to do that. Very enjoyable, very satisfying. Okay. As far as the content in the book, there are a lot of simultaneous ships sailing that carry us through the book. First off, I think especially because we live in a world that's one generation after the release of this book and after the release of People's History of the United States, and the ways in which even throughout a lot of mainstream society, we have all benefited from a popular acceptance of a lot of this historical information and perspective, which was once fairly obscure and really mind-blowing. And a lot of it remains mind-blowing today when you simply read it again or realize perhaps a different context that's in now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Alrighty, so there are a lot of sections that carry us through the book that I like to refer to as like greatest hits of misunderstood American history. So we go very early on, we jump into Christopher Columbus. And again, this is the kind of stuff that like shattered my mind in the early and mid 90s, especially being a 14-year-old in 1992 for the 500th anniversary of Columbus and his ships landing in the Americas. it's easy to forget how jarring and how radical it was to bring up a lot of the myths and shattering a lot of the myths that we accepted and that almost all of us probably went to high school learning about a lot of this stuff. Importantly, this book takes a lot of the contradictions or the myths or simply like the misunderstandings of history and sort of props it up with quotes and evidence from those characters or those events' own time. And so here, for example, we have Christopher Columbus, doing his thing, ravaging the Americas, but it's peppered with quotes from his contemporaries, of his homie Michel de Cuneo writing about his 1494 he was doing his own conquest of Haiti in 1494. And he's like, I'm going to take a minute to write about my homie Christopher Columbus. And really underlining, yes, right now, it's time for him to put into execution his desire to search for gold, which was the main reason he started on so great a voyage. And then we have these, a lot of this has to do with intersections between radical shifts in European Christianity, along with the dawn of capitalism. And in our current understanding, a lot of this thanks to Ibram X. Kendi and stamped from the beginning, the relationship between the birth of capitalism, the birth of transatlantic chattel slavery, and the birth of race as a concept in the way that we understand it today. And so to intersect all of these things and to recognize that all of those play a role in his quest for gold, for the crown, his quotes at the time, "I will make war everywhere and every way that I can. I will subject you to the yoke and obedience to the church and to his majesty. I will take your women and children and make them slaves." He's not hiding anything. He said it right there at the time. And so I tried to, in these moments where James Loewen is really leaning into here is what these historical characters wrote themselves about themselves at the time, he's simply laying it out on the table for us to absorb. And so I tried to kind of carry the torch with that kind of bluntness, thankfully kind of softening the landing a bit, using the magic of comics to be able to provide extra layers of context and meaning, but also soften the blow enough that we're able to understand it perhaps on even deeper and broader levels. Okay. Also, moving on, still with Columbus, it's important in a lot of these chapters, when we're talking about Columbus, establishing evidence for possible earlier explorers and how those possibilities change our ideas of the Americas. So thankfully, now we are all fairly familiar with Leif Erikson and with Norse explorers to North America 500 years before Columbus. This is just a page that has to do with, textbook authors being unaware that ancient Phoenicians and Egyptians sailed at least as far as Ireland and England, that they reached Madeira and the Azores Islands, they traded with the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Canary Islands, that Phoenicians and Egyptians sailed all the way around Africa before 600 BC, and that there are varying levels of evidence for explorers from both Ireland and from Africa landing in the Americas in different sections several hundred years before Columbus as well. Importantly, there is not enough concrete evidence to be able to make a solid call on it, and that's sort of the reason he chose to include them in the text. Oftentimes, he refers to this as teaching the controversy. I did use that phrase in my adaptation of the book, but in the world of the 2020s, I also wanted to be a little cautious because I think it's easy for a lot of people to confuse the idea of teach the controversy with both sidesism. And so I was basically trying to explain or illustrate the concept without using a phrase that might actually throw people a little bit off the track. Okay. and sort of gets into Eurocentrism from there. Like this just moves on with possible earlier explorers. Here's an incredible bit of anecdotal evidence. Comparing two other pre-Columbian expeditions from Africa and Ireland provides an interesting vantage point for considering this debate. When Columbus reached Haiti, he found the Arawaks, the indigenous people of what is now Haiti, bearing spear points made of guanine. The Arawak people said that they got them from black traders who came from the south and the east. The south would be the southern half of the Caribbean. The east would be Africa. And guanine is identical to the gold alloy preferred by West Africans who called it guanine. But there's power in simply laying out that information and being like, so much is lost by a desire to have a definitive answer, particularly for a history textbook. And I think like writers, I think, and also James Lowen thought that writers, editors, and publishers feel that throws their product off course to simply not have a concrete answer that people can refer to answer tests or whatever. Okay, moving on to another greatest hit. The Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving. This was really fascinating to revisit while doing this for the comics adaptation. This pushes back against like the myth of pilgrims arriving from Europe to what is now New England, but as an untouched wilderness, when in reality, the Pilgrims hardly started from scratch in a wilderness. Throughout southern New England, Native Americans had repeatedly burned the underbrush, creating a park-like environment. After landing at Provincetown, Massachusetts, and exploring by boat, the Pilgrims specifically chose Plymouth because of its beautiful cleared fields, its recently planted corn, which, as Midwesterners, we're familiar with corn. We know that corn doesn't replant and regrow itself. It's like it lives in a symbiotic relationship with human farmers in order to keep growing. So when you see corn growing, you know there are people doing their thing. And its useful harbor and a brook of fresh water. It had, in fact, already been a lovely town, for New Plymouth was actually Squanto's village of Patuxet. The settlers encountered no wilderness here. As one colonist noted in 1622, the year after the first Thanksgiving, "In this bay where we live, in former time hath lived about 2,000 Indians." Okay, so now we're going to do a side quest about Squanto real fast. Squanto is wild, y'all. Okay, so as we all know, in the mythical story of the first Thanksgiving, yes, it is true. Squanto, an extremely helpful dude, taught the Pilgrims how to like put fish into the ground as fertilizer, how to get crops going, undoubtedly helped keep them alive for an entire winter, knew English and served as a translator between these new Pilgrims and the indigenous people of the surrounding area. But you kind of miss along the way. You're like, whoa, hold on. How did Squanto speak perfect English? Turns out Squanto is like the real life Odysseus. Squanto, I think as a 9-year-old boy, was kidnapped by an Englishman and taken back to England, where he was forced to live for a long time in indentured servitude, which legally speaking we could call kind of like a slavery-light situation. Typically, it's enslavement that comes with a specific termination point by which you're supposedly going to be free. It is, however, enslavement. So he's kidnapped and enslaved in England. Along the way, the dude who kidnapped and enslaved him sold him to another enslaver who then whisked him away to Spain, where he was enslaved for like another 8 years or something. He managed to escape and spent several years winding his way back himself to England. Once he got back to England, now as a man, he successfully argued like in a court of law for his own liberation. And they were like, Squanto, you got us. Okay, so Squanto liberates himself by arguing for his own freedom in England. And then he manages to negotiate a deal to get on a boat that goes from England back to what is now New England. So he shows up back in his old hometown of Patuxent, and not a single human being is there, because like he showed up in 1620, and in like 1614 to 1618, a massive pandemic ravaged through New England and killed 95% of all of the people who lived there. So he was the only survivor of his town. And so interestingly, there is a practical side of his cooperation with these colonizers from England, where he's like, I'm probably going to die if I don't get some other people around here and kind of like work with them. So he was also thinking in like a practical survival mindset. Absolutely fascinating. And it sort of blew my mind when I was reading through that again. And I'm like, wait, no one ever asks, how did he learn perfect English? And why is this not its own chapter in American history? Is just the Homeric journey of Squanto. Okay, another major point in James Loewen's work is that, particularly in early American history, that the historical record shows us other possibilities, specifically like thriving societies outside of European colonists and conquerors. For example, many thousands of white and black Americans who joined Native American societies knew that peaceful coexistence was possible. And this section is sort of pushing back against this sort of predetermined approach to American history, that this was an insurmountable clash of cultures between European and indigenous cultures in the Americas, and that there was no opportunity for both cultures to survive and thrive or to make something new and coexist. Another alternative to war would be an explicit commitment to racial harmony, a nation that did not differentiate racially between native and non-native people. American history has several examples of these multiracial enclaves known as tri-racial isolates. So, Revolutionary War hero Crispus Attucks, who was an escaped slave of African, Wampanoag, and European ancestry, was a member of a triracial isolate. So in addition to the Wampanoags, there were the Lumbee in North Carolina, the Seminoles in Florida, and more from all the way from Louisiana to Maine, all triracial isolates. So keep that in mind when like at least the Seminole Nation is very widely known amongst native nations in the Americas, a triracial isolate. The legendary Roanoke colony in Virginia probably didn't die out, but it was instead absorbed into the nearby Croatoan nation. Triracial isolates were generally viewed with contempt by their white neighbors, which is why they chose rural isolation. Our textbooks isolate them too. So from James Loewen's sample, Making Lies My Teacher Told Me, in the original edition, he looked at the 12 most popularly used high school level U.S. history textbooks, and then for the updated edition, added 6 more. So out of the 18 history textbooks, not a single one mentions the term triracial isolate or the people that made up these societies. Not a single book. Alrighty, so as we've seen, our society sometimes lies to itself about its own past. Maybe our textbooks only reflect those falsehoods because we want them to. And it may also be why textbooks avoid controversial subjects. And this is really where, I was making this book at this really highly charged intersection of politics, culture, and a war for control of information. And every single thing that was motivating James Loewen's work, that was getting to the core of decisions made by school boards, textbook adoption boards, angry community members, fear of angry community members, et cetera, was just as relevant in 1995 as it is today. And so it's fascinating to sort of see this 3 decades apart. So in public opinion polls in 1995, at least half of Americans agree that, quote, books that contain dangerous ideas should be banned from public school libraries. But who gets to say what's dangerous? Usually, people tend to think it's other people who need to be lied to. Well, it's for their own good. Children get confused with all these ideas in their heads. Lying to young people is a slippery slope. Once we start, when do we stop? How do we stop? Who decides when to lie and which lies to tell which age group? And I will tell you, as a dad, you will paint yourself into a corner really fast when you have to start doing like second, third, and fourth layer lies to like seal the gaps in the other lies that you're telling your very small children. Young people are incredibly perceptive and can figure out almost immediately, once they get a whiff of being manipulated or lied to, all bets are off. And this is one of these things where, like, as a young person, I was very aware of that. And then really, I went through that window of adulthood where I didn't have kids that were old enough yet. And so I kind of forgot about that. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, right, kids are much smarter than adults. Okay, how do we decide what to teach once authors and the public decide not to value the truth? Words from 1995. Another major thing that gets into the nuts and bolts of how so much misinformation and so much falsehood finds its way into American history textbooks goes into how textbooks are made. And a lot of this like breaks down for all of us the difference between primary sources, straight from documents and people who experience something firsthand, and then secondary sources, which are what journalists, academics, scholars, historians do with those primary sources, and they make their book, they write their article, and that becomes your authoritative secondary source. In March Book 2, I will toot my horn momentarily and say that March Book 2 was the first book ever published on the planet Earth to get the names of the original 13 Freedom Riders correct. And we realized it, we were just talking about this like 30 minutes ago. Okay, we realized this the day before that book had to go to the printer. And we were fact-checking some stuff. And not only was it a lesson in how like a lot of information that we were dealing with in the March trilogy was only recently publicly available information or recently digitized primary sources. But we're like, okay, we got the correct Freedom Riders. We're like, how did this happen? Why does everyone have it wrong? And then we realized that in 1962, the year after the Freedom Rides, there was this authoritative tome about the civil rights movement up to that point. And I forgot who wrote the book, but Andrew Iden, the co-writer of March, he pinpointed, he was like, oh yeah, this book, this is the starting point where he swapped out one name. There was one writer who hadn't joined yet, and there was a journalist who he mistook for a writer and put him in there. And then that book, the secondary source, became the authoritative reference for anyone looking for information about the Freedom Rides, and it just spread like that. Wild. Okay, but importantly, like, a lot of these textbooks are simply clones of each other. There is actually no one at the wheel writing, fact-checking, editing, or updating any of these books. A lot of it is literally interns and temps. And the names of the authors are, in fact, rented. And so it gets into a couple of interviews in the book that's like people who work at textbook publishers being like, yeah, we contact a famous historian and we throw them a couple of bones and we use their name. And then we get our temps to like copy the information from this other book that's 100 years old, and we've got our textbook. Okay, one of the major problems that James Loewen talks about is called heroification. It's really how he starts the book, and how one way we kind of kneecap ourselves when thinking about American history is that American history is full of heroes among us. But by identifying someone as a hero, we sort of place them, in a category that does not allow for complexity. As we begin to streamline and simplify our understanding of a historical character as a hero of some kind, we also begin to mythologize them so that they conform to this new streamlined notion of who they were and what they were all about. All right, so this is a suffrage march, I think from 1913, obviously, U.S. Capitol's in the background. He opens up talking about Helen Keller. Another fascinating part, Helen Keller, radical socialist, a member of the IWW. She was on all kinds of government watch lists. He opens up by being like, we know a lot of amazing stuff about Helen Keller and able to overcome adversity and learning to read and write and all this stuff despite not being able to see or hear. We know about the anecdote with learning the meaning of letters through the flowing water on her hands. But then he's like, you ask somebody, what did Helen Keller do? What did Helen Keller do with the vast majority of her entire adult life? It's like, no one can tell you what Helen Keller did. In fact, Helen Keller was a absolutely devoted human rights advocate who spent most of her time working with people who were poor and who had suffered various physical disabilities, specifically blindness, as a result of their poverty. She grew up rich, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that because she grew up with severe disadvantages, but also severe privilege by just having a rich family, she recognized along the way in her early adulthood that she was able to overcome her challenges in part because she grew up with money. And she made this profound connection when she started digging into the disproportionate prevalence of blindness in the poorest cross sections of the United States, often due to malnutrition, due to workplace accidents, et cetera, but then recognized that disability was often a class issue, and this was something that kind of radicalized Helen Keller. So, getting back out of the weeds, we have the suffrage march, and this is where, photographs were still a pretty rare thing. The cameras are like 100 pounds. They take forever to set up. So this is the photo that we have of this march. And there's some people lining the streets, etc. Okay, so Helen Keller was a guest of honor at that march from the U.S. Capitol to the White House, demanding women's right to vote. However, most people along the route were actually protesting against the march. They were counter-protesting against women's rights to vote, and they instigated a mini riot. The marching route was only a mile long, but it took 6 hours to go a mile because of the agitation from the counter-protesters. And Helen Keller wound up so exhausted and unnerved that she actually canceled her speech. But the public outcry after news coverage trickled out from the marchers' mistreatment also helped reinvigorate the movement at a crucial point. So this is where a lot of stuff that doesn't line up with the streamlined idea of who an American hero is often simply gets omitted, and the most interesting and fascinating parts, what we can learn from the best, often falls by the wayside in American history textbooks. Abe Lincoln, a great example of heroification. Obviously, great American hero. Paid with his life for his dedication as the leader of the free world to secure the liberation of Black Americans from enslavement. As a counterpoint, so when I was like 14 or 15, there was this hardcore band from San Diego called Struggle, and a great band, a pre-Locust band. So there's an insert from the Struggle 7-inch that had like a photocopied $5 bill with Abe's face on it, and like a 19th century racist quote that he said along the campaign trail that was explicitly opposing voting rights and basic civil rights like the right to be on a jury, hold property, etc., for Black Americans. And it was like a stunning moment for me, and in a very punk way, just sort of like the insert in this record just basically laid the hypocrisy bare. And I remember showing my mom and not really like being mature enough to have like my own additional layers of context. So I remember showing my mom this Abe Lincoln quote and her just being like, "Oh, Nathan!" And like she was not ready to deal with that. However, yes, Abe Lincoln, my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 6. It butts up John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. And basically, we often forget, because of heroification and the desire to mythologize and simplify Abe Lincoln, yes, he was a professional politician. So, like, if we can show Abe Lincoln's internal racism, his debate, and the way he functioned as a politician, these would be amazing teaching tools. Students could see how speakers modify their ideas, how they code switch to appeal to different audiences, highlighting that we cannot simply take historical figures literally based on isolated things they say. If books recognized Lincoln's racism, students would learn how racism isn't limited to Klansmen, but has pervaded our history. And if students could study how Lincoln struggled with himself to apply America's democratic principles across the color line, they would see how ideas can develop and how a person can grow. And all of that gets lost through the process of heroification. All right, just had to throw in this amazing painting of John Brown with a tornado screaming into the wind. Okay, so John Brown, radical white abolitionist, organized and led armed revolts into the prairie land to liberate Black Americans from enslavement from entire towns throughout Kansas, organized with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman to play a role in the Harper's Ferry raid and organize other armed insurrections to liberate Black Americans from enslavement. Wild dude. Also, definitely a murderer. Not up for debate. Totally a murderer. We're going to lay that out first. So as we get into John Brown, the other half of this chapter, one of the major themes, coupled with Abe Lincoln, is how in American history textbooks, we lose this idea that ideas themselves are a driving force in American history, or throughout history, period. So just as textbooks underplay white racism for fear of offending certain parties, they also neglect radical idealism. And just like how textbooks remove the racism from slavery, they also remove the idealism from efforts to abolish slavery. So you'll often find, especially like this is where James Lewin posits, that in the long run, the Confederacy won the Civil War. In the 21st century, the Confederacy won the battle of ideas because the myths of Reconstruction, like the lost cause myth, a lot of these Confederate myths are from his study, these are the only areas in American history where these textbooks have actually regressed in the last 30 years. And obviously we can see all around us the legislative pressure, the social pressure, the pressure from neighbors with automatic weapons and fascists who live in our communities. So also it's important when we're talking about ideas driving history is we want to pay attention to the fact that the writers of these textbooks are a product of their own time and of the circumstances of their own education, and recognizing sometimes that when something doesn't seem to add up, a lot of it has to do with a very human cause. So here's a little graph I did about John Brown's treatment in American history textbooks for the last 160 years. So he was executed in 1861, I believe, and here we have, the end of Reconstruction is 1877. Now, from 1861 to about 1890, John Brown was depicted as perfectly sane. And there are great slivers in there that really outline a very cut and dry account of what he did as this armed insurrectionist and liberator of Black Americans throughout Middle America and Virginia. And it's fascinating that how unpolished a lot of the historical analysis is in these 19th century textbooks. And then from 1890 through 1940, which is what he calls the nadir of race relations in America, the absolute low point, and then through the entirety of the civil rights movement, from 1890 to 1970, he was depicted as absolutely insane. And this is where a lot of, the second thing you learn about John Brown is he heard voices. He heard the voice of God commanding him to lead these armed rebellions. He was absolutely crazy. Okay, however, and then he's been slowly regaining his sanity in textbooks since 1970. All right, what's interesting is that at the time, from first-person accounts and from primary sources, there is not a single account of anyone who ever knew him ever thinking that he was insane, including his jailers, the prosecuting attorneys and judges, other people in jail while he was, working on his beard, awaiting trial, and like explicit enough that they're like, yes, indeed, yea, verily, this was a very sane man. He seemed to have a good head on him, just a very violent dude or whatever. But specifically, there is not a single shred of evidence anywhere that he ever heard voices. And he gets into this fascinating thing where like it compares and contrasts Nat Turner and John Brown. Nat Turner actually did claim to hear voices and actually did claim to hear the voice of God commanding him to liberate Black Americans. But for old white dudes writing American history textbooks between 1890 and 1970, the actions of John Brown, being an idealistic, anti-racist white person taking up arms to free Black Americans, simply did not make any sense. And that impacted their analysis of what he actually did historically. And it's interesting to see the shift in coverage in real time compared with cultural and political shifts in the United States. Alrighty, another major problem that James Loewen points out is the myth of relentless progress. So basically, one of the major narratives throughout history textbooks is that things are always getting bigger, better, and brighter. This is the story of American progress. It's the story of coming out of one mode of government into another mode of government, of Americans gaining right after right after right, and oftentimes backsliding simply doesn't work with the narrative arc, and it simply gets left out. And oftentimes that makes the reading confusing, and it makes a lot of historical facts not seem to make sense, because the part that is problematic for the writers or the editors is simply omitted. And they're like, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Okay, the future looked brighter. Most Americans believed their children would inherit a better planet and enjoy fuller lives. This is the America in which most textbook authors grew up, and it's the version they still try to sell to students today. And believe me, this is a problem if you hang out with young people. I mean, even in my generation, when I was an angry, idealistic, creative teenager, I could read the writing on the wall, I could smell it, and I guarantee you that my kids can smell it too. So this is another thing where like, we adults are the lame ones who just assume that kids aren't gonna notice stuff when they notice things so much more quickly than we adults do. He really gets into breaking down a lot, as I was saying, a lot of myths of like the myth of states' rights being the primary cause of the Civil War, as well as myths surrounding enslavement, the myth of Reconstruction, the lost cause fantasy, and how these have really pervaded American culture. And as I was saying earlier, unfortunately, this is where neo-Confederates have won a war in popular imagination by really instituting the lost cause fantasy, the myths of Reconstruction in a way that oftentimes, as James Loewen was saying, a lot of his Black students in the American South also entered class believing the lost cause fantasy, believing the myth of Reconstruction and why Reconstruction failed, et cetera. This page is just kind of a fascinating thing that breaks down that not only did states' rights not motivate Confederate secession, but importantly, as the Civil War continued, the Confederacy very quickly began to deny states' rights within its own rogue nation. And historically, states' rights have always been claimed by whichever political party is currently out of power, just painting in very broad strokes here. As a power play. That's something that's typically leaned on. But as early as December 1862, Jefferson Davis explicitly denounced states' rights as being destructive to the Confederacy. So as a result, what is so wild, especially for me, like as a kid who grew up in the South, I'm from Arkansas, but I also grew up in Alabama. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all from Mississippi. So there are isolated counties in Arkansas, Searcy, home of the indie rock band The Gossip. There was a clandestine pro-union Arkansas Peace Society there that helped supply up to 6 companies worth of Union troops to fight against the Confederacy. Wynn Parish, Louisiana, just this one parish refused to secede from the United States. In southern Mississippi, you have the Free State of Jones, an entire county of Mississippi that refused to secede, as well as Winston County, Alabama, became the Free State of Winston. We all know about a little place called West Virginia. A third of Virginia was like, you know what? We're going to stick with the United States. This is not worth it for us. It's easy for us to gloss over the fact that an entire state just left another state to be like, no, not for us. But also, northeastern Tennessee in its entirety tried to do the same thing as West Virginia. And then Confederate troops had to occupy what they considered their own territory to prevent the whole eastern chunk of Tennessee from rejoining the United States. And armed guerrilla actions occurred in every single Confederate state except South Carolina, and it became dangerous for Confederate soldiers to even travel in parts of Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. Establishing that states' rights as an idea was so contradictory that it could not mobilize the Confederacy during the war, and it was quickly abandoned as an ideological glue that would function for this rogue nation. Alrighty. Another big issue is talking about people power, talking about history being shaped by the dedication of regular people like us to organize and to make change. This was my comfort zone and my delight because it basically was a chapter that was like a mini return to the March trilogy. And it was really fun to kind of get back in there, and I feel like this is kind of an heir to March in a lot of ways in my work. So I was like, doing this for you, Congressman Lewis. But importantly, we talk about like the Hollywood approach to, let's say, the civil rights movement, which is always hierarchical, not only just from government leadership down to organizers in the movement, but also within the civil rights movement, it is often presented as a hierarchical structure that is, as Andrew Iden would call it, a tale of gods and kings. But one reason why we made March was because John Lewis explicitly was like, look, SNCC was a non-hierarchical, it was intentionally a decentralized, non-hierarchical entity. The civil rights movement was a movement which was organized from the ground up, and there was so much conflict, not only against a hierarchical structure, but between conservative and liberal movements within the movement, between young and old within the movement. It was society and microcosm. It was, when we say like it was of the people, it was very much of the people. But one of these problems, especially when you're talking about heroification and when you're talking about omitting things that don't fit, we're also talking about cheerleading for the government. And often history textbooks, they don't want to get into it too much. They're like, we're going to just assume the government at least tried to do the right thing, even if they didn't, or whatever. So often this Hollywood approach to the civil rights movement often is like, well, John F. Kennedy, as president, proposed these laws, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. President Johnson passed these laws through Congress, and here we are. And the main problem isn't even that it has like such a glossy, rosy portrait of presidents. It's because it removes the power and agency from the Black Americans who, by and large, organized and generated all this change. And we are all, I imagine that many of us are familiar with the use of the passive voice to kind of tiptoe around culpability or accountability or pointing things in a different direction. So you'll see the passive voice used in a lot of these historical moments. So another quote from a textbook was simply that another civil rights measure, the Voting Rights Act, was passed. Well, that's good, it was passed. Hey. Sometimes they'll reverse the order in which those two important bills, those two important acts were passed. There's one book called The Challenge of Freedom, one of the main 18 textbooks, that reverses the roles of leader and led. So this is a quote. In June 1963, President Kennedy asked for congressional action on far-reaching equal rights laws. Following the president's example, thousands of Americans became involved in the equal rights movement as well. In August 1963, more than 200,000 people took part in a march in Washington, D.C. When in fact, as I learned, drawing March, John F. Kennedy was not a fan of the civil rights movement or securing equal rights for Black Americans. So much so that when the March on Washington was happening, and actually let's go to panel 1 here, where I crack a little joke. This is also seen in March Book 2, where young John Lewis is at this meeting with the big 6 leaders of the movement and John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. And basically, John Lewis remembers that he did not speak during that meeting. He was like, I just listened. This wasn't my time to speak. Like, I'm just going to take this in and see what we can do with it. So I did this for my buddy, where young John Lewis is like, oh, don't mind us. And President Kennedy's like, I won't. In fact, when the week happened for the March on Washington, John F. Kennedy was so rattled by the March on Washington that he sent Vice President Johnson to Norway because he feared that LBJ was too sympathetic to the cause of civil rights. And he was like, you know what? You have something really important to do in Scandinavia, and I think you need to do it right now. It may take 9 or 10 days, and if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Okay. When our American history textbooks minimize the potential power of the people for the sake of what they consider to be patriotism, that's not a neutral action. They take an overtly anti-democracy stance because now young people are not learning that it is the actions of regular people that helps push change through our society. When we're always waiting for leaders or the myth of leaders to bring change down from the mountain, not only is it disempowering, but it also kind of makes things stop making sense when you start to actually read and learn anything about the power of the people to change things in the United States. You're like, oh, but wait. Alrighty. So the last update that James Lewin made to this book was in 2017. And so when he passed the torch to me, a lot of this had to do with updating it post-2017 and facing unprecedented challenges to a shared concept of truth. Okay, so we may be familiar with this. These are identical photos taken by the National Park Service from the top of the Washington Monument. On the left here is the 2009 inauguration of Barack Obama. That's the crowd on the mall. On the right is the 2017 inauguration of the guy. And these photos side by side caused a stir at the time. But let's also, this is from January 20th, 2017. Let's go to January 22nd, 2017, where we have Sean Spicer, his press secretary, his first press secretary, saying, and let's remember the words, on the lectern at the White House, this was the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. And so this panel is the only time I left a specific note in the book that marked my presence. I'm not a tracer. Insert comic book joke here. But I look at photo reference and I draw things without tracing. These inaugural photos are the only things I traced in the entire book because I knew, recognizing built-in weaknesses because of its delivery in comics form, I was like, I have to make this as impervious as possible to accusations that I'm manipulating the visuals for a specific perspective or political aim. I have to trace these photos. So I spent a long, long day drawing like 10,000 teeny tiny blobs. Every single person I could find is there. And what's wild is while I went, you start to get a better grasp of like what's a shadow, what's a tree, what's a trash can. Things start to come together. And I actually thought that I really did think while I was inking it, I was like, this is probably going to wind up like not being as crazy and disproportionate as I remember it from the photo. But as I got tracing and got inking, it actually got more extreme. I was like, this is messed up. I was like, seriously, where are the people? So anyway, it was also, it was wild knowing that I would probably have to carry on the torch from Mr. Lowen to realize that I would then be accountable for the information I brought forth, and then like figuring out ways to leave the sanctity of his text as written, and if I needed to update something or add a modern context, whenever possible, to try to do it using my art instead of adding to or changing the text itself. And this is part of the magic of comics, is that the non-textual information is still information. Every detail that you notice, that you take in when you're looking at a comic is all information. And the joy of a comic is that a comic is entirely context. By that meaning, you can compare and contrast any part of the book with any other part of the book at any time. It's an incredibly active reading experience, and so many extra layers are happening in your brain while you're reading and absorbing a comic. In terms of learning from recent history and making connections, this is a good example where this is the end of a chapter about memory holing the recent past. So I did add 2 extra little captions, same caption, 2 separate panels, where James Lowen's original text, that the upbeat, happy endings in our textbooks send a message about history itself. By avoiding serious discussions of events and trends in our past, and by implying that no real thinking about our history needs to be done, textbook authors suggest that our past has no effect on our future. And as long as those connections are buried, we can hardly blame students for concluding that the study of history has nothing to do with their own lives and their own future. And I just add, I have Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, labeled as a violent subversion of democracy, 1965. We have John Lewis being struck by an Alabama state trooper and various deputized white supremacists. And then panel 2, we have January 6th, 2021, violent subversion of democracy. This, again, it's a matter of balancing personal and creative risk and creative license, along with the sanctity and gravity of his own research and his own statements, trying to balance viewpoint with objectivity. James Lowen is not someone who shies away from viewpoint. He kind of gets into the fact that everyone has a viewpoint in every book they've ever made. Like, that's okay to acknowledge, but trying to make a lot of the undercurrent and a lot of the pizzazz happen on a visual level while keeping his text untouched. All right, so anyway, usually there are little elements from each book that I do that crosses over into the next, and I just do it for myself because it's fun. And little details or phrases or themes will give a hint of what the next book is. Since I did Fall Through and Lies My Teacher Told Me at the same time, the protagonist and narrator of Fall Through, Jody, shows up in 5 or 6 panels in Lies My Teacher Told Me. And really that's because I'm just constantly drawing classrooms full of people, and you can only make up so many people. And at a certain point I'm like, wait, I make up characters all the time. Why don't I just use those? Which brings us to Fall Through. So basically, what's weird is so my fiction work is basically magical realism. It takes place in a world that is virtually identical to ours, except there are constantly demons, curses, and ghosts and hexes. So despite being locked into this magically infused world, there are a lot of similar themes that link both Lies My Teacher Told Me and Fall Through. But specifically, Fall Through is the story of this underground punk band, a fictional band from Arkansas in the early mid-1990s, and they go on their one tour in 1994, but basically, here are 4 members. We have Diana, the singer, Napoleon, the guitar player, Jody, the bass player, and Steph, the drummer. Diana, the singer, has embedded a spell into a song on their only 7-inch record that basically turns their 1-month-long tour into an infinitely repeating, looping, kind of wormhole-infused adventure that they are now stuck in. As real life is continuing, the clock in San Dimas never stops ticking, and it becomes an internal struggle as well as a creative struggle to figure out how to break out of that cycle, and then there are a lot of feelings involved. But thematically, it's the idea that in this sort of underground community, that the unique reality and like the weirdness that's really, really hard to put into words and hard to specify, what makes something so special and so interesting, often becomes a simplified, mythologized version of itself so that people can spread it and talk about it and think about it in a certain way, but we lose so much of the interesting stuff. And another central theme right here in the opening spread, when you're in the middle of something like this, as it's happening, you don't notice what doesn't add up. And it's that sort of that notion of being in the middle of unfolding events or not having enough context to be able to make a call about what's going on around you, and thus having that unsettling feeling as if like examining American history that doesn't seem to make sense, but there's nothing pointing to the fact that elements have been pulled out and fabricated. And it's that disquiet of knowing that something has gone awry and not knowing what it is. Alrighty, so a lot of this has to do with mythologizing and creating legends out of something that is very hard to encapsulate and put into a tiny little box. All right, so I was in several punk bands. This was my longest lasting one. That's me with the rainbow striped Daisy Dukes. I was in this band called Sufi Nun Squad. We played here at the Pirate House here in 2001, and I've played here several times throughout the early 2000s as well. We were a very weird band that was sort of emerged from a very like precious, emotionally vulnerable breed of underground hardcore punk that at the time even we would use with the sort of dismissive term, calling it emo, which means something very different now than what it meant then. But it's always a term which is always generally dismissive and is always misunderstood at the time in relation to the object of who or what is to be called emo. It is eternally misunderstood and misapplied. But basically meaning that like our elders, the 18-year-olds who were in bands who inspired us in our town, were really, really into feeling deeply and taking things very, very serious all the time. But as like 14-year-olds starting our band, we didn't have deep feelings yet necessarily, and we were mostly guided by like snack foods and like our missing childhoods or whatever. So we sort of like functioned as a real-time counter to that and became like a weird mix of Public Enemy, the Big Boys, and the Muppet Show as like a whole thing. Like the whole Muppet Show became our band, complete with like puppets, props, sort of humiliating, embarrassing audience interaction, and a lot of it was to cut down on the idea of pretension, the idea that you are too cool to move your body, that you're too cool to be in this kind of consecrated free space. So where I grew up in Little Rock, especially pre-internet and pre-kind of gentrification, urban renewal, there were a lot of forgotten, ignored spaces. And so if you wanted something cool to happen, you had to make it happen yourself. But there were enough people who needed that to happen who were able to find these ignored public spaces where a lot of magical, short-lived things could happen. So most of our shows were free, they were public, they were outdoors, and they were illegal, which also resulted in a very unique, cool mix of human beings who would show up and who then made up the musical scene and the creative community that we had. So what came out of our town was much, much weirder than punk scenes in more established towns, like Ann Arbor. Debatably, well, the first punk houses in America are from Ann Arbor. Like the Stooges Funhouse and the Trans Love House are the first two punk houses. So thank you, Ann Arbor. Okay, so when I started Fall Through, originally, I was kind of like, I was starting to reflect on a lot of that stuff and my experiences in my own band and the relationship dynamics, but I wasn't really interested in doing a music book. So I was like, really what I want to talk about is the experience of eating, sleeping, and driving with your band family. I was like, that's the whole book, no music. And I was like, this is the core of what it means to be in a band. So my terrible idea in retrospect was I was like, oh yeah, I've got this. Okay, here's the deal. We're gonna do this and like move through whatever scenes, and then they start to set up at the show, they're all plugged in and everything. And then there's never a note of music in the entire book. Like they're ready to play, and then right before the first note, smash cut to another time, another place, it'll be disorienting, zero music. People will love it. And then eventually I was like, no, they won't. But it was like, more importantly, like, I don't think that'll work for me either. So I guess structurally and thematically, instead of taking the music away from the readers, I took the shows away from the band inside the book. So what happens in the story of the book wound up me pivoting to solve the problem that I just established, where I tried to cut all the music out, and I liked where it was headed, but it didn't really work for me. So most of writing is problem solving. And so the way the story plays out, for those of you who will read it, check it out from your library, it's free, basically works around that and finds a different way to express the same sentiment. Also, important to know, Fall Through is pandemic therapy for me. Kept me sane. I cannot tell you, like I started penciling this book in like 2019, but when I really got down to it, at some point in 2020, all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, this book is completely full of people crammed into private and public spaces, breathing on each other, sweating all these droplets on each other, saliva's going, they're yelling in each other's faces, their hands are all over each other, and it's fine. And being reacquainted with that kind of physical intimacy in 2020 and 2021 really helped me stay sane. So especially as like a Southern punk band, a Southern punk scene, everything is just sweaty and damp all the time. But because of it being a pandemic book, I got really into drawing little sweat droplets and breath droplets everywhere. So there are like 10,000 sweat droplets in this book. And I want you to know that every single time I drew one, it was helping me get through the pandemic. And it was a great way to kind of reckon with that lost space that had been taken for granted. Also, it really explores band as family. And like Sufi Nun Squad, which I was in, literally was a family. Like we had siblings, we had couples who then married, we had breakups and divorces within and throughout the band. Like things remained very personal. And we stayed a band for a long time so that we could spend time together, and it became much more difficult to be together. But that was our goal, was to spend our family time. And in our last year of existence, we just kind of like realized that we could just go visit each other. We didn't have to book an entire tour and take time off from work and spend thousands of dollars, like being in someone's basement or whatever for a month to make it happen. We can just go see our friends. It's okay. We're adults. A very simple realization, but very profound when you spend half your life in that kind of band family structure. Now, the origins of this band, the band is called Diamond Mine. Also, this is basically a soap opera. And so when we're dealing with like an interdimensional magic-infused soap opera, I'm basically saying like the biggest influence on this book is also X-Men, the greatest interdimensional soap opera of all. So the origins of the band Diamond Mine goes all the way back to this book, Come Again, that came out in 2018. But I started it like 2011, 2012. Basically, my favorite band from the town where I live, Bloomington, Indiana, are some great friends of mine who were in this band, Fat Shadow. There's basically Bloomington's version of Heart, except punk. So yes, I am describing a perfect band. So you will see the vocalist, Dawn, dead ringer for Diana, and the bass player and singer, Aaron Toby, who's also a graphic designer for a lot of my books and did the graphic design for the cover of Lies My Teacher Told Me, is a dead ringer for Jody. All right, and basically I wanted to do a tribute for Fat Shadow. And so, I started like imagining them and reimagining them as, in my mind, like Arkansas's first fictional punk band. And they wound up going into one little isolated scene in Come Again, where there's like an argument happening in this like, tourist trap town at a farmer's market. And in the background, their band is playing at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning in a world that does not know punk exists. And they just blow people's minds, they shatter everything, and they get driven out of town and literally drive off into the sunset, which doesn't make sense, I'm now realizing, because it's like 10 in the morning. But that's okay. So they basically Boba Fetted this book. And I was like, man, Diamond Mine is amazing. And I got really sad that that was it. I was like, oh, there's no more Diamond Mine. So immediately after that, I was like, no, they're going to be the stars of the next book. But I had already written them in 1979, and I was trying to carry their adventures forward, and then the anachronisms and time paradoxes started happening for me, and I was like, okay, how is this going to work in a way that is compelling for me as I make it? And this is where, again, writing is problem solving. So you have to follow your curiosities and look for what doesn't add up. Now in Arkansas, we weren't like y'all having the MC5 and the Stooges. We didn't get, Little Rock didn't even have a punk show until February of 1986. However, Northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks, punk did start in 1979 there. The reason why, and throughout the South, this is often the case, is because of the stupid Sex Pistols. So the Sex Pistols played their last shows in the American South. I think they played 8, maybe 9 shows. And their very last show was in San Francisco, legendary show at the Winterland, where Johnny Rotten said his famous line, "Do you ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" And then they broke up. So what happened was Sex Pistols would play these stops in town, and the surrounding areas would immediately get punk bands, and a punk scene would emerge. So they played Memphis, and they drove a cutout around the state of Arkansas. They're like Memphis, they're like Baton Rouge, they're like, that's good. And they're like San Antonio, Fort Worth, Houston, whatever. And then they're like Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa's very close to the Arkansas state line. And so it's like, okay, this is a photo of their actual Tulsa show, their next to last show during an ice storm in January 1978. And I was like, okay, if we're talking about shattering these myths, the question is, who actually showed up at this show? I wonder if there's any local news footage of who actually was there so I can learn more about the demythologized version of these shows. Why, yes, there is local news footage. Yes, about 200 people showed up, and the vast majority of people who showed up were because of the marketing and PR push that took over local news stations that the Sex Pistols were coming through town. So people were coming because of the spectacle that this band that they heard about on the news was playing. So you got a lot of weirdos and civilians and some, just a very interesting mix of people who are exactly the opposite of the way you would imagine these Sex Pistols shows as actually being at the time. So from there, basically I have a teenage Jody showing up and going to this show as a 17 or 18-year-old and sort of having this moment of revelation and seeing through the image of the Sex Pistols and being formed by it. And that produced another problem for me as a writer, which was now she would be 34 years old in my story in the 90s, which, let me tell you, the oldest people in our scene when I got into punk, the moldy oldies would be 22 years old. And so I was I'm 45 and I go to shows now, but I was this would not be happening in an underground scene in 1993. So again, this is where writing is problem solving. And I would go from there to be like, oh, this isn't like this is a contradiction that determines the way the story is going to go. So this brings me to these creepy faces in the front. This is sort of like an expression of this moment of transcendence that people are having throughout the book, where they realize that something singular and special is happening in that time and place, and that time and place only. They're being transformed by it. But as I was drawing these, I was like, wait a minute, this feels so familiar. Where do I know these faces from? Where do I know the style from? And what am I conjuring? Like, something's ringing a bell and I don't know what it is. So I went on a journey that takes us back to the birth of the graphic novel itself. So it turns out I was thinking about the drawings of this guy, Lynn Ward, debatably the creator of the graphic novel. So he produced 6 woodcut-only, wordless novels and pictures between 1929 and 1936. And I think the WPA originally put out some of them. He self-published some of them as actual woodcuts, and some of them he made 200 copies of a few of these. The Library of Congress had released a box set of all 6 of these, and I highly recommend you check them out from your library. Or buy them or whatever. They're absolutely amazing. They are wordless, but they carry so much if you consider the context of being made in the first half of the 30s. So much that's going on with the Depression, with the rise of fascism and the rising conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, between rich and poor. It's fantastic, but also so weird and dark and dramatic. And so some of these faces were just so haunting to me that the drawings themselves wind up influencing the characters in the book itself. So here, as they craft the song that guides the book apart, or guides the book along, we have Jody being like, once Fall Through was added to our set, I couldn't help but notice its immediate bizarre impact, a crystallizing mist, the haunted looks, Diana's transmissions from an alien source, or as Patti Smith would call it, a fire of unknown origin. It's the same thing. So these faces are the fire of unknown origin, manifesting itself. Alrighty. On a lot of his visual themes throughout the first 6 graphic novels, and by the way, this is 4 years before the comic book was invented. Graphic novels predate comic books. So a lot of this falling star motif winds up working its way through a lot of the plot mechanisms of the book. But still, all of a sudden, it occurred to me, wait a minute, I know where I know Lynn Ward's art from these books from. It's actually from the record I got the book title from. So 30 years ago, my friends in Little Rock, my punk elders, put out this 7-inch. The band was called 5-0, and the 7-inch is called Fall Through. And the teenage members of the band stole 2 of the Lynn Ward books, Madman's Drum and The Wild Hunt, I believe. And stole the books from the library. They're not proud of it. One of the members apologized to me a few months ago. He's like, don't tell anybody, but we stole them. We're very sorry. And basically, Lynn Ward's art wound up being the layout for their entire Fall Through record. This record, it's one of my favorites, but also it was massively influential in my development, in my expression as a teenager. So this is one of those moments that was so eerie that I was like, this is like charged with some kind of magical power. So again, you lean into it, and yes, there is bootleg magic at the root of this entire book. And a lot of this wound up working out as a reference to another big influence of mine, which is a new version of Sleeping Beauty. This is one of my favorite books I would read with my kids when they were younger. It's called Sleeping Beauty, a Mid-Century Fairy Tale. And I think it's by David Roberts and Lynn Roberts. It's the same jam that you know from Sleeping Beauty, but since it's mid-century, you've got Morwenna the witch, and when she comes in to cast the spell, which is that, Aurora will like prick her finger on a needle. She'll fall asleep for like 1,000 years or whatever. Since mid-century, it's Aurora's 16th birthday, and the witch brings over, anonymously, leaves a turntable and an Elvis record at the doorstep for her 16th birthday. So she pricks her finger on the turntable needle, and I was like, yes. So this panel here, I did a direct nod to it in a slide I showed a few slides ago, because you gotta be up front with your nods and your influences sometimes. In terms of my own writing process, when I'm doing fiction, usually the big ideas, the major themes, they come immediately to me. That's what I build the entire book on. It's like, I want to do a book about this or about that feeling or whatever. Then it's a matter of like, in my sketchbook or my journal, I will often have like these lists of little moments, anecdotes, vignettes, something that stuck with me, questions that I have. And oftentimes I will like write and consolidate lists of all those little moments just to keep them for when I need them. And I kind of wait for a character to emerge that I care about. But once I get enough of those moments, I cut up a bunch of index cards and I write each one on its own piece of paper, and I literally rearrange them on the floor. By physically looking at the ideas in physical space, I see what their relationship is to each other. And I look for connections that I may have missed between any of these little moments or any of these thoughts. And slowly, I start to imagine a character being a part of some of these moments, and very slowly a story begins to emerge from these shuffled up index cards on the floor. Then from there, once the story has really started to work itself out, I do the same thing, thumbnailing my comic. But for fun, I cut and staple my own little mini comic full of blank paper, and I do the thumbnails really small in a teeny tiny comic. And I work out the rough script just in the margins, and I just kind of do it fast and keep going. And again, a lot of it is like, I can make radical changes at this level because so much less effort is required to try something again or go in a completely different direction. And eventually I realized like, okay, this is all about like this magic that's infused into this record that this underground band put out. Eventually I'm gonna need to deal with the record. Like, what is this record gonna be? What's it gonna look like? So I decided to do one more nod to sort of a local sibling band of ours called William Martyr 17 that was around from 92 to 94. We shared a guitar player, so we were in fact sibling bands. Basically, here's the last local show they ever played, which was at this little gazebo that you will see throughout the book. I'm over here sort of on the right-hand side. Someone's yelling in my ear, trying to tell me something that I'm sure I cannot hear at all while the band is playing. Tragically, like we were all like 16 or 17 years old at this point. Chris Horn, the drummer of this band, they played one more show in Fayetteville, Arkansas, up in the Ozarks, about 2 weeks later, and they drove back to Little Rock, and then Chris and his best friend Ahmad were driving around all night. The sun was starting to come up, and they were just taking like a nice drive out in the country to like watch the sun come up. Something happened, and they got in a car wreck, and Chris died instantly. And for as 16-year-olds that were already knit very tightly together in this town, who were building up something together, having Chris, who was in 3 bands simultaneously, sort of yoinked away from his friends and his loved ones, but also just his passion and his creative connections, really transformed us as a creative community, and it made us have to grow and mature and reflect upon what we were doing and why we were doing it. We started to take a little bit more seriously the time that we had and the fact that all of this only happens once. So in a nod to Chris, I aesthetically wanted to link the William Martyr 17 record to Diamond Mine's record. So I moved through the process of their DIY decisions of how they laid out and designed the record, much in the way that all of our records were made at the time, the process of turning it into a living thing. And then I just went ahead and made the record. And a lot of it is, this like silk screening, spray paint stencils, rubber stamps, And then a lot of it is like going out into the garage and cutting up stencils and spray painting record covers and everything. And yeah, the record cover and the lyrics to the song are hidden in the book, but you'll have to find it under the dust jacket. That's the secret. I didn't make that very difficult for you. It's under the dust jacket, but it's hidden. Like, you may never be able to find it. Okay, so to really wrap it up, and thank you for being very patient, this was going to be the end of the story. And again, I just could not deal with there not being any more of the tale of Diamond Mine and their personal soap opera. So there is another book. It's a prequel that I've already penciled. It's written. I'm inking it and coloring it right now. It's called Diana, and it's much more a character study and way less musically oriented. It's sort of like taking leaps and bounds in different directions and trying new things. It's even heavier in the X-Men soap opera minus the powers situation. And it's been immensely satisfying simply because I felt more comfortable allowing characters to develop in ways that were surprising to me as I was writing and drawing. And it's this very rare occurrence where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I didn't mean for this character to think that or say that. And yet it's very obvious that that's what they're doing. Like, they're alive. And these are the moments that motivate so much of my making fictional comics, of like being a storyteller is waiting for characters to make their own decisions that seem obvious to me. Even when I'm the one guiding it, it's very obvious they have some kind of independent trajectory. So I'm very stoked about Diana. It'll be out in like 2.5 years, something like that. Comics take a long time. All right, thank you for being patient. Does anybody have any questions? It can be about either of these books. It can be about March. It can be about making art or comics in general, whatever you would like to talk about or ask about. I know someone has a question. You can do it. Yes.
I'll get in the technical aspects of it. So the technical aspect of it, I'm just admiring like how well the scan came in of like all of the water, all the ink wash and stuff like that. I was just wondering how you handle that, because I feel like every time I do grayscale stuff, it just comes in a mess when I try to scan it in. So
it took a long time for me to, especially because my Photoshop skills are so rudimentary. For me, if I'm doing something in gray wash and I'm printing it in black and white, like Liz, my teacher, told me, these are black and white grayscale files. Basically, I get my scan, and then from there, usually I just go straight to the curves. And basically, with line art, you want your blacks to be black, you want your whites to be white, and then you're really just looking for the best way to have that gradation look smooth, but also like have enough contrast to like punch. So I'll adjust the curves so that for me, 79% or above goes straight to black, and usually like 4% and below goes straight to white. And then I'll just like tweak the lighter end of the grays, usually push them up a little bit, and the rest of it I just leave alone. When I have to have grays in a full color scan, this is what I really love, because this is where the gray is always warmer and richer looking, but it's also much harder to control. So for this is a totally, like I scan it in, and the first thing I do is I go to the brightness, and I'm like, brightness, -8. And it makes the colors a little bit less washed out, but it makes everything dimmer and weirder. And I'm like, don't panic. And then I go to select the color, and I start pushing the black layers as far up as I can. And then I pull the black out of the white for selective color. And then if I need to like push the saturation of the color, I just do that in saturation. But it took a long time to like, I look back at some of my earlier stuff, like even March Book 1, and I'm like, I messed those files up. It is. But it's just, a lot of it is like figuring out how to keep the blacks super punchy and how to drop out the white into negative space. And then you're just left with that middle zone. Yes?
Hi there. I'm just curious. When you first set out to tell stories, graphic novels or otherwise, did you intend to mainly focus on nonfiction stories? Was there a fiction influence, etc.?
I didn't at all intend to focus on nonfiction. In fact, like, I didn't have interest in telling nonfictional stories at all. And I didn't, like, I guess, like, important detail, I started self-publishing as like a 14-year-old. So this is like a long prehistory of me just being like immature and dumb and like getting to a point where eventually I'm like, all right, now I'm ready. But I feel like I had things I felt like I needed to say that were definitely straight out of my life, but I didn't feel comfortable speaking from an autobiographical standpoint. Thank goodness, because those would have been really boring, self-absorbed comics in retrospect. But the first time I did a nonfiction comic was, so I've been a full-time cartoonist since 2009, but for the decade before that, my full-time career was working with people with developmental disabilities and dual diagnoses in various relationships in their lives, residentially, like private life, job coaching, et cetera. And I started to notice the dynamic between being in punk bands and having my whole life structured around being eternally mobile and just like leaving for a month at a time to go on tour or whatever, but that I was disrupting the lives of not only the people I was working with, but my coworkers as well. And it's sort of like the way that power dynamics work in a situation where your creative pursuits are butting up against your professional responsibilities, but also like the ethical implications of being a tool to help someone else live their life more fully and with more dignity. So I was having a hard time. I was like 25, and like I kind of didn't feel comfortable expressing anything. So I was like, I feel like I'm just gonna like stop, and I'm gonna make this like a short 5 or 6 page comic just about that dynamic and about what it's like to work with people with disabilities and how it relates to my life and how I feel like I'm messing things up a bit by being this like mobile, libertine young adult. And it was very satisfying to do. It was very alien to me, but it was like, since I decided it was just gonna be a short little comic, I knew I had this very limited scope. So I was like, okay, how much room do I actually have to express what's important to me? And I think it came out pretty well. And then a couple years after that, I did a short journalism comic about the Tulsa Massacre in Greenwood in 1921, which at the time, like pre-Watchmen TV show, the Tulsa Massacre was relatively unknown throughout popular culture. So I was just kind of blown away learning about it. And that was sort of my first foray into actually, like, I went to art school, so it's not like I know how to research things. So that was my first foray into being like, how do I learn more about this historical event? And then, same limitations. What do I choose to make it fit into 9 pages? But it really wasn't until March Book 1 where someone was like, I have a story about my life and my relationship to this people's movement. I want you to draw it. And that was a radical transformation in my own expectations of storytelling, but also what I needed to bring to the table to do it.
Please help me thank Nate one more time.
Thanks, gang.
And just remember, Nate does have books and original art for sale right here in the lobby. And another day, we invite you to come back to the library and look at his art on display on the lower level.